skydiving. This is amazing.
Yeah, but you know what else is amazing? An iPhone 6S for just $49 at Metro.
Really?
Imagine streaming all the way down with that amazing camera. I'm switching.
That's smart.
You know what else is smart? Parachutes.
Woo!
Switch to Metro and get an amazing iPhone 6S for only $49. Metro by T-Mobile. Phone offer requires port-in of number not currently active on T-Mobile network or active on Metro in past 90 days. See store for details and terms and conditions.
We're gonna have a TV party tonight. Alright! We're gonna have a TV party, alright!
Tonight! We've got nothing better to do than watch TV and have a couple of brews.
Everybody's gonna hang out here tonight!
Alright!
We'll pass out on the couch. Alright!
Tonight! We've got nothing better to do than watch TV and have a couple of brews. Don't talk about anything else. We don't want to know. We're dedicated to our favorite shows.
And tonight, our favorite show is finally, we're finally doing it after like 2 or 3 reschedules, and it was dark out and there were wolves chasing us, and they opened a new gas station down the block, and there was a Marvel movie out, and the stars are bright, they're big at night deep in the heart of Texas. We're finally reviewing The Crown Season 2. And I am your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly I'm Flemmy, Mr. Mark Radulich. And joining me with a hot scotch in his hand from our Canadian office, ladies and gentlemen, the inimitable Andrew Graham. How do you do, sir?
I'm doing well, Mark. How are you? In the tradition of Ron Moore, the scotch this evening is Talisker Distillers blend. Distillers Edition. It's not a blended scotch; it's a single malt. So I'm doing quite well. How are you?
How many scotches have you had tonight, sir?
About 3 sips, so we're doing pretty good.
Oh, fantastic! All right. Well, like I said, we're back here finally to start talking about The Crown Season 2 before The Crown Season 3, so we're still ahead of the game, even though we've delayed the show a few times. It's just the two of us tonight. No Mrs. Graham. David's not here from our other Canadian office. Just the two of us hanging out. So let's get to it. Season 2 is an interesting season. The premise, let's see. Season 2 takes us into the Suez Crisis, the retirement of the third Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, the Profumo affair, and the birth of Prince Edward in 1964. We also get into a big part of the season is Prince Margaret and her marriage to what's the fellow's name? He's a photographer.
Tony
Mama Luke. And we're
Anthony
stumped.
Armstrong Jones.
There we go. So we're going to talk about that, but what I want to start off first. First of all, what did you think of the season? Let's start there. Overall, second season, you've actually had a chance to go back and rewatch parts of it. Comparatively to the first, on its own, what did you think of season 2?
It's interesting trying to compare the two because on some level they're very different beasts. I mean, season 1 was definitely very highly focused on, the process of her, ascending to the crown, going through all the machinations of the coronation, and kind of assuming her role as monarch. season 2, and that's the kind of the dramatic tension and everything like that moves forward. Season 2 is a little bit more spread out. It has, kind of the big, if you have to call it a big theme of anything, is that it is much more a marriage-based show where it's talking about, Elizabeth and Philip's marriage and Margaret and Tony's and the marriages of the various prime ministers and things like that. That all said, I don't know if that worked quite as well as with season 1. That said, when the show gets into either the nature of being the monarch or the nature of some of the the depth of characters. I think we're going to get into a little bit of that, but that's where it's really, really strong.
So, right front and center of season 2 is the continued strained relationship between Elizabeth and Philip. We talked a lot in our first podcast about season 1 about his being emasculated, this being the 40s and the 50s, what the perception of manhood is and how he has to deal with it being turned on its head because he is married to the Queen and what that means to him. I think we were pretty sympathetic to his point of view and his reactions to things. Season 2 really digs a little deeper into that, into his, and I think at large, just how the way the Crown operates affects people. I mean, you think about him and you think about Margaret, and little things like making an announcement about a marriage or, having a friend who just happens to be cheating on his wife. The Crown is intrusive. If I had to sum up season 2 in a single sentence, what season 2 tells us is the Crown is intrusive. Would you agree?
I think that's a pretty fair way. And I think it's interesting that it seems to go as much to say that the Crown is intrusive to everyone around the Queen, but on some level, a lot of what this season comes to is the character of Elizabeth I, or Elizabeth II rather, coming into her own as monarch, being more comfortable in that role. We're going to talk about one episode where she definitely stumbles, but she also has a couple where, she kind of acts as, that head of state, that head of government, or not the head of government, sorry, that head of state to Great Britain and is able to, kind of assert herself. And she gives a pretty killer speech at the one of the later episodes that we'll get into.
All right, so let's just talk about let's talk about her and Philip through this. I think where we find Philip is he's in the Navy. He's sort of dealing with their marriage and the intrusiveness of the Crown by just not being there. I think it's fair to say that.
On some level, yes. I think a big part of and I thought it was kind of cool that they took the first 3 episodes and made it a bit of a one-piece arc dealing with his trip around the world and dealing with some of the the fallout with Eden and the Suez Crisis, and kind of tying that all together in kind of a 3-episode arc to start the season.
Yeah, I thought it was very.
Kind of focused it really well.
Yeah, I thought it was very, very strong way to start the season. The feeling that I got, and just weigh in here when the mood strikes you, but the feeling that I got was, I feel like he was very much shown his role in the first season, and it's an uncomfortable fit, but one he's trying to get used to. And I guess, by being away, by going around the world, by being kind of out of the public eye, so to speak, he's able to much more tolerate the intrusiveness of the crown. I'm going to keep bringing that line back up.
Oh, it's a good theme.
That's how he wears that burden, and it all comes to an end when and jump in here because I forget some of the details, but his like private secretary is found to have been cheating, and the whole thing just comes unglued, and he's got to come home, and he almost throws like a tantrum about it. Like, this was working, this was working for me, this was working in general, I was happy, and now because of something that doesn't even have to do with me directly, though we'll find out at the end of the season, not so much, it all has to come to an end, and how resentful he becomes of her, the crown, the situation, life in general.
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of this also goes to, and I mean, it definitely gets into this a lot in the later episode, Paterfamilias, in terms of, he looks English, he sounds English, he wears a Royal Navy uniform, but I think Philip he had always felt, and I think in a lot of ways he was always treated as a bit of an outsider. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, he was kind of from this fallen line of Danish and Greek royalty that had been deposed after the First World War. He had been smuggled out of Greece in an orange crate. And, I mean, some of the things that happened to him, like, for example, the fact that I think this was a conversation that had happened in the first season, but, like, the fact that the house remained the House of Windsor and not the House of Mountbatten when she became queen, which would be the normal case, even where there's a prince consort who would then his last name would still become that royal house or royal dynasty.
And this all, once he's back and she's trying to get, and there's these lines about are you in or are you out? Divorce is not an option, but are you gonna walk this path with me, or are you going to throw yourself on the floor? And and he talks about even his son outranks him. Like there has to be, much like they discussed in parts of the first season. Where he's like, look, I get that there's certain things I cannot exert myself on, but there has to be there has to be a place where things give, and I'm able to get my way. And one of the things is, Charles outranking him and, and wanting more respect from the courtiers and palace staff. And so in February 22nd, 1957, Philip is crowned prince and dubbed His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
Sorry.
Sorry, did I mispronounce it?
Yeah, it's pronounced Edinburgh.
Edinburgh. Okay, got it.
Yep.
So, just moving on through the season, dealing with the two of them, and then finally, getting to episode 10, Mystery Man. It's winked at, it's sort of nudged at. They sort of dip their toe in there, but then they don't really deal with it until the very end of the season. That he is not faithful to her. So what do we know about that? Any stories there? Any knowledge? Do you know? Has it been written that he for sure wasn't particularly faithful, and she just sort of, as she says, or he says rather about her, made a fanciful practice of looking the other way? Because it's funny because I brought that up to my wife, and she was like, If Philip is also almost challenging her to call him out on his shit, and she up to this point she wouldn't, and it was an interesting dynamic between the two.
It was, and I mean that was kind of one of the more, or you know what? Here, let me backtrack. I'll talk about kind of your first question. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, and I haven't done a lot of reading on this, mainly because this is where you get into really, really unreliable sources. I mean, there's always been rumors. There have always been rumors. There's always been jokes about, I think I remember even as a kid hearing a joke on a Canadian satirical show. It's like, oh, Philip's, boffing one of the chambermaids or something like that. And I mean, it's definitely been something that's been out there for a long time, and I guess what kind of came as interesting to me in terms of the way they kind of handled it, and again, I think the show doesn't take a position on it as to definitively say, yeah, he cheated or no, he didn't. And I mean, I think that's kind of an interesting choice in some way on how they phrase that. I mean, they obviously set it up to say that, you know, he had this picture of this Russian ballerina and stuff like that, and they never get him to come out and kind of say it straight up and down that this happened. Then again, I also wouldn't be shocked if they wouldn't say that because they were afraid of being sued for libel.
Yeah, sure. I think she also says something along the lines of do what you need to do to get your release so that you can be a part of this marriage. You know, as elevating a marriage between the queen and her prince, you know, or in other cases, the king and queen, to a place where we all, look, we're going to be doing animal things, just don't get caught doing it. And, you know, do it in dark corners so that you can, you know, so that you can commit yourself to this higher thing, which is this, you know, regal marriage, which I found fascinating. You know, it's because, I mean, said any other way, it's like, look, go out there and bang prostitutes so that you can be committed here at home and be a good father and dad. Can you do that, please? Can you do what you like? No one says that, right? No one would say go out there and do what you need to do so that you can be a better person at home. You know, you would be looked upon poorly, generally speaking. I mean, some would. I'm certainly not speaking to the polyamorous people out there. They would disagree.
Not necessarily in Europe. Like, okay, apparently, I guess one story I once heard was when one of the French prime ministers died, Mitterrand, who was a jackass. At his funeral was his wife, his daughter, and his mistress.
Sweet.
Standing all right beside each other.
So what I hear you saying is I'm only speaking to the Puritan American ethic. Everywhere else, we're like, yeah, no, that's about right.
Well, not quite that far, but I mean, there's definitely some weirder stuff that happens in, I think, the upper levels of any society, especially when you've got some kind of, you know, aristocracy or something like that. I mean, you know, Christ, Kennedy shows up in this season, and I mean, we all knew about his dalliances.
Yes, they are. It is amazing the amount of forgiveness. Not to get off on a tangent, but you know, you've heard if you've heard any of the Damn You Hollywoods, and I know you listen to that show. You've heard me and Robert say just how forgiving and how you know, head in the sand this country can be about Kennedy and by extension Bill Clinton, but how unforgiving we are of, you know, of the Bushes or our current president, you know, and as we like to say on Damn You Hollywood, Bill Clinton was a rapist. So
yeah, that's not inaccurate.
All right, let's. Anything more on this? I think we've covered it as best we can. I mean, I think if I could point to things that I really enjoyed about this, I think it was the sort of tug of war in the marriage between those two, and I think it ends with you know, his head in her lap, and I thought it was like a good image to go out on for the season, kind of summing things up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think on some level, as much as, I mean, again, I'm trying to say what the show says versus what, you know, may or may not have actually happened. I mean, I think the whole concept of quote unquote the deal, as I do air quotes in an audio format, the deal has never really been talked about to the best of my knowledge. So I mean, that might have been a construct of the show, but I think part of it is. And I mean, you know, you can understand they must have had some kind of understanding on some of these things. Like, I mean, even going back to, you know, him taking over the coronation committee and things like that, where, you know, something like that would have happened. But I think at the end of the day, when you look at the fact that they have been married for, 60 plus years, that there is a definite bond between these two people. And, you know, maybe we'll talk a little bit about what their plans are for seasons 3 and beyond at the end of the show, but I mean, I think that's going to become kind of an increasing point of conversation.
Before we move on to Margaret, I just want to close it because you happened to bring up that tied into these first 3 episodes are the Suez Crisis and the stepping down of the Prime Minister. That's a rough fucking scene, man. when he
Yeah.
when he comes back and that whole table just sort of turns against him, and was it Harold Macmillan who succeeds him, and then at the end of the season he steps down as well. I mean, yeesh! I haven't seen a backstabbing like that since the last time I watched Julius Caesar.
That's not too far off, and I mean, I think this comes into my complete history nerd bias, but I kind of wish they'd spent a little bit more time on the Suez, because, you know, they kind of talk about it in passing. The Suez was a big fucking deal. Like, it was very potentially, like, at the time, people were legitimately worried about it starting World War III.
Sure.
Because I think they kind of put the pieces in place to say that the Israelis, the French, the British, and the Soviets were all involved in this thing. So, like, the way that it ended up getting resolved, and they don't talk about it, and this is also my nerdy Canadian bias, but I mean, the way it ended up getting resolved was that basically it got taken to the UN Security Council, and the Canadian ambassador to the UN, Lester B. Pearson, actually suggested the first UN peacekeeping force. So that's how that whole thing started, in terms of, like, people are fighting, we drop in a bunch of guys to stand in between them and try and keep the peace until reason prevails, we hope.
As far as the drama in the show is concerned, what did you think of the whole portrayal of his coming in and stepping down and all of that?
I mean, I think that's pretty spot on. I mean, it's kind of unique to we'll call it the Westminster system of Parliament. So, I mean, you know, what we use in Canada, what's used there, where, you know, you can have these successions of prime ministers without there necessarily having an election happen, because the party still has the most seats in Parliament. So, and this is kind of a thing that has happened before, and it's also kind of an extended version of this, where traditionally what happens is that the prime minister is the prime minister, and then the person who is what's called the chancellor of the exchequer. In Canada, that would be finance minister. In the U.S. would be the secretary of the treasury, is then kind of the presumed heir apparent that would then step up. And then very often they will run directly into a brick wall. So, for example, a really good example of this one in recent memory is, and generally it's not even their fault, it's by what the person before them left them. And, like, for example, a really, kind of recent example would be Tony Blair being followed by Gordon Brown. Tony Blair was kind of the hotshot that came out of nowhere. Gordon Brown had been the longtime party loyalist. Tony Blair come in and kind of screwed a great many things up just in time for Gordon Brown to come in and be hit by the train.
Okay.
And you kind of had this one in succession. I mean, I think we're kind of going down the Macmillan path, and I mean, I want to call back to kind of a related piece of media, which is, did you ever see The Queen?
No.
So this is actually the same. This was done by the same writer who produced this series, Peter Morgan, and it was the one with Helen Mirren. And the series starts with actually Tony Blair being invited by Her Majesty to become Prime Minister. And the first thing she says to him is that, "Don't you know you're my sixth Prime Minister?" The first one was Churchill.
Nice. And it's funny, she actually says something along the lines of that when Macmillan goes to retire. It's like, you're the third Prime Minister and I haven't been Queen for like 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, she takes a right strip off him.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think we kind of all have this image of the Queen as this what's turned into this sweet older lady and stuff like that. But I mean, she's got a back made of iron. Like, there's been cases where it's like a couple years ago there was a controversy over Parliament being prorogued up here, and there were controversies. It's like, we might have to take this to the Queen to referee this out, and nobody wanted to do that. Because
we'll be good. We'll be good.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you can kind of imagine it. I mean, the way they're going to dramatize some of this stuff is, I can kind of imagine what conversations might have happened with Harry during some of his antics in his younger years.
All right, let's switch gears here. We're about the halfway mark in our show tonight, so let's quick talk about Vanessa Kirby as Princess Margaret. Now, she had a thing with Peter Townsend. That, of course, goes the way of all flesh. And then she turns around and she meets Bad Boy. You know, she meets Anthony Armstrong Jones, known as Tony, a society photographer who she will eventually marry. You know, a bit of the polyamorous fellow himself. I just the way that that whole relationship is portrayed, they might as well have shown like him just riding into town on a motorcycle with Cool Rider playing in the background. I mean, she falls.
Well, he has a motorcycle.
He does have a motorcycle. That's true. Yeah, but she falls for him hard, and you know, there's this tension over, will this one get accepted? Do I ever get to choose? You know, a man to marry, or will the crown dictate that I must be in a? And they even allude to this somewhat with prior to that bit where she runs into, I can't remember the character's name, but it's one of the lesser royal folk, and he's a bit of a drunk and
Billy Wallace.
Yes, and an idiot. And they almost marry, and of course he fucks that up himself. But the relationship there, the subplot of that relationship, and then how it's dealt with in terms of the crown's intrusiveness. Give me some of your thoughts, sir.
I'm not going to lie. I actually found this part of the story somewhat less compelling than I did the last time round with Townsend and kind of the constant interferences. I mean, I think you still see Margaret as a bit of a she comes off as, I would say, somewhat less sympathetic in this season.
Yeah, she's just a shade away from throwing a tantrum in every other scene.
Oh yeah, she's definitely away from that. And I think that kind of contributes to it. And I mean, I think you understand where the relationship between Tony and Margaret works, but I think on the flip side, you're not as rooting for it as much because, I mean, you can kind of tell that Tony's quite the cad.
He's got a lot of love to share.
Yes. Well, apparently, if you want a heartthrob for a period English costume drama, you call Matthew Good because he ends up at the end of Downton Abbey as well.
Oh, nice. Oh, well, okay. It's all connected, these British shows. But, yeah.
Don't worry, I'll go deeper than that.
But yeah, she's got this. What I found intriguing about Vanessa Kirby's performance as Princess Margaret this season is it's kind of half split between she just wants to live her life and she is in most of the time sort of direct opposition to the crown and its intrusiveness. You know, it's a constant wrestling match between her and the crown. That she is also provoking at times. Like, I feel like there's a bit of her that's demanding attention, that is, jealous of the fact. This is at least my interpretation of some of the subtext. Maybe I'm off. Who knows? But what I was seeing in the character was kind of I want attention too, and I'm not going to get it because I'm not the queen, so I'll just poke the badger periodically and then cry that the badger bit me.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think you even see shades of that. And I can't remember the episode from the first season, but where the queen goes on tour and she then kind of starts, improvising on speeches and creating scenes and things like that. And I think that's a pretty accurate way to kind of describing a lot of Margaret's character arc this year.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite bits of the season is she goes, I want to announce that we're going to get married, and the queen says, "That's fine. I'm having a child. That's going to happen first." And she's just, you never let me do anything I want, Ricky. You never take me to the show. And she was like, "Will you calm the fuck down?" So it's just there's an order to things. You're gonna get your way. Be patient. It's like talking to my son.
No, exactly. Oh, don't worry. That was we only started just now because of bedtime, and I was definitely having a three-nager moment with my youngest child. So. But you know what? I mean, on some level, like that's one of the scenes where I think I'm more sympathetic to Margaret because she said, you know, when they have this whole conversation where it's like, well, you know, no other public announcements can happen till this child is born. It's like, okay, so that's 6 months away. This is all the same stuff you told me last time with Peter Townsend, and look what happened.
Right.
So I think on that point, she's pretty fair to argue that. But I mean, you're right. Like she definitely kind of comes off as, you know, an inch from a temper tantrum every 10 minutes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on her? If not, I want to move on to one of the subjects that you and I talked about before we started recording that you wanted to bring up.
Yes, and now I'm trying to remember what that was. I will say I have one funny anecdote about Margaret, just from watching it with my wife, and you know, definitely, you know, some of the little idiosyncrasies they capture about the characters was that, you know, Margaret was a constant smoker, constant drinker, and in the scene where she tells Elizabeth that she's pregnant, she's like, you know, hammering on a glass of whiskey or something like that the entire. And my wife's watching is like, wait a second, is she drinking? Says, yeah, it was the 60s.
You know what's funny? I think I had a similar reaction. I'm just like, she's something along the lines of like she's pregnant, right? Or something like that, and like she's drinking, right? And like, yup. And I was like, yeah, all right, I got it. So let's talk about episode 6. I think this is one of the ones that you wanted to discuss, and it's definitely you know we're leaning away from relationships to a degree because there is a degree of relationship between the uncle and his niece, the queen. But this is history. This is an important thing to discuss here. The episode is entitled Vergangenheit. That's how.
You know what? You got it better than I was. I was probably going to get it. So bravo.
I figure if I'm just throaty with it, I can get through the word. But essentially, what we have here is our good friend the Duke. Oh gosh, help me out here. Duke of
David Windsor, formerly Edward VII.
Yes. Now it's an interesting thing here because I do know for a fact that there was a period of England wanting to give Hitler his way, and nobody, and it even comes up in the episode. Nobody had known the degree of what the Holocaust was, the scope and the degree of what the Holocaust was, what the camps looked like, what was really happening to the Jews. And there was there was this, you and I talked about Paris 1919 and how they created this monster out of, essentially that agreement. And this idea that at some point they thought that a sequel to the War to End All Wars was probably a bad idea. So let's see if we could work things out with Hitler. In retrospect, you look at an episode like that, you look at that period of history, and you go, how could you not have seen this coming? That, like Hitler, the greatest evil of the 20th century. But when you're right there in the thick of it, and all you're trying to do is prevent thousands upon millions of people to dying, you can see where the Duke of Windsor is coming from. But man, does this episode make him look bad.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think the other side of things when you talk about, not only what people didn't know about what was going on inside Nazi Germany at the time, and in the lead up to the war, because that's basically, I mean, once September 1939 rolls in, then everyone's like, all right, let's go kick their asses. But up to that point, the biggest fear that people didn't have in the 20s and the 30s wasn't fascism, it was communism. And them seeing this what was perceived to be the stabilizing force of this, strong man in Germany being on the continent, trying to stamp down all the communists.
Getting the trains to run on time.
Sorry?
getting the trains to run on time, which is a common turn of phrase, but it's a symbol of your country is functioning.
Yeah, exactly, and that sort of thing was something that they talk about. There's referencing back again to not to the Queen, but to the King's speech. There's a scene where in a flashback where before he became king, George V is arguing with Edward VII. While Edward VII was still king, and he's talking about these destabilizations of monarchs and things like that, and Edward VII turns to him and says, "Well, Adolf will sort it out." Like, I mean, he was seen as a bit of a bulwark against communism, and a lot of the communists were the ones who were overthrowing the monarchies that they were always terrified of. So, it gets talked about in episodes like Marionettes, and I mean, it's kind of a key driver for a lot of Philip because his family was one of those royal families that was deposed in the upheavals after the end of the First World War. So that was kind of some of the mentality where something came up, but I mean, this is also a little bit different in terms of the plan that they were talking about here, because this was after Edward VII had already abdicated, and actually during the war that was part of their plan to try and take England out of the war.
It's an interesting episode to say the least. Ultimately, she ends up exiling the Duke of Windsor from England. He's there because he wants her support in a career move, and while he's there, is it weird that I saw his point of view? That, hindsight being 20/20, no, he looks like a bag of shit, and essentially it feels like that's what's guiding her decision to exile him, which it stands to reason. But when he's telling her, you're looking at it from with the benefit of hindsight, you weren't there in the middle of it while it's happening, with little to no knowledge of what was going on next door. And it's and I think that's it. The writing of that episode, I guess, is what I want to comment on and say it really is one of those where one it was excellent writing. It was a thoroughly enjoyable episode, but I think it's weird because on the one hand I feel like they want you to root against the Duke and see him for the bag of shit that he was. On the other hand, his argument made sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it does, and I mean, I'm kind of on the other side. I mean, part of the conversation that also comes up is again, it goes to that timing where it's like, okay, pre-1939, that makes a certain amount of sense. You can kind of look the other way. I mean, God knows we look the other way at some countries we associate with these days, but you got to
remember. I mean, I think IBM was working with Nazi Germany. I think we were selling weapons to both sides of the war until we got bombed, if I remember correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I was
pretty much selling just to. Well, you were doing this kind of neat little thing called the Lend-Lease program, which actually was helping the Allied for the most part.
Okay, I thought there were periods where we were also selling to the Germans, but okay.
Yeah, First World War is a little bit more split. Let's not even go down that rabbit hole.
Okay, fair enough. My point being that I think we tend to want to look at World War II like it's a Marvel movie, and they were clearly defined bad guys. A guy with a red flaming skull. There was a robot running around making sarcastic remarks. There's the whole thing. And they were clearly defined good guys. They wore bright uniforms, and they stood for America, Nancy Reagan, and apple pie. But the actual war is a lot more muddied.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I mean, I think one of the justifications that they use, I mean, this is where things can flip, is one of the points that Elizabeth brought up that was totally correct was the fact that all of these conversations about him potentially deposing her father was also coming during the Blitz when the Germans were carpet bombing, parts of the UK and killing 40,000 civilians. Of course, at the same time, this was happening the other way with nightly raids going to Germany, and you certainly get into a degree of the history being written by the victors, and thank God we won.
Fair enough. Let's move ahead here. I know we wanted to talk about the Kennedy episode, which is which one is it? Yes, Dear Mrs. Kennedy. I'm going to turn it over to you to lead the conversation here. Tell me about the Kennedy episode. What do you want to talk about?
This one was an interesting episode. I'm not going to lie, I think this might actually be one of the weakest episodes of the entire series, unfortunately. The story's really interesting. It kind of tears the drapes off some of the stuff around the Kennedys, around the fact that John F. Kennedy was doped up a lot of the time because of a number of different health issues. Obviously issues with their relationship. It gives the Queen one of her great moments of diplomacy, and I think that's something that kind of ties back to the last episode where, pardon me, when you talk about the role of the royal family in Britain, one of the things it is that they are basically an accessory diplomatic corps. So, they'll often be used to try and informally, outside of the official government, represent Britain and represent their interests. I remember right after Brexit happened a couple years ago, there were stories about the uptick in visits to the continent by Will and Kate and Harry at the time as kind of goodwill gestures to kind of represent Britain unto itself as outside of whatever the government policy was.
I thought it was an interesting episode. It's not one that I remember real well. I do remember the bit about first of all, I enjoyed the woman who played Jackie Kennedy. I thought she was great, and I definitely enjoyed sort of I paid a lot. I watched a lot of news during the Bush administration, and I always used to enjoy whenever Tony Blair and Bush were on screen together, because you had Bush, who had trouble with public speaking, and then you had Tony Blair, who I think recognized the importance of being an ally to the United States and with Bush, but definitely. You ever watch American Dad?
On occasion.
So there's an episode of American Dad where every time the wife talks at a party, she embarrasses Stan, and Stan pushes her in the pool. And I always got the feeling that when Blair was standing next to Bush, he was very close to pushing him in the pool.
Yeah. No. I definitely get that. The thing I struggle with, and this could be really odd of me to say, I found the affect and the accents put on by the actress who played Jackie Kennedy, and by, I believe it was Michael C. Hall who played John Kennedy, correct?
Keep going, and I will check that for you.
I'm pretty sure it was Michael C. the guy from Dexter. Anyway, I found those accents to be incredibly distracting.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were put on almost to the point of caricature. And I've seen other, I've watched a lot of stuff that has the Kennedys, and I've seen, just to name a movie like 13 Days, the Costner movie about the Cuban Missile Crisis, where I didn't find the particular Kennedy accent to be that much of a distraction. But in this one, I don't know what it was, but it was almost like it was turned up to 11, and it was very distracting.
Yeah. I think when I think there are certain actors where they try to do, like an American accent or a drawl. They overdo it for drama, and and you're right. It sounds like a caricature, even if that's not where they were going with it. And while I enjoyed the performance from a dramatic sense, I can totally see that with the gal who played Jackie Kennedy. And yes, it was the actor you said before who played John F. I did enjoy isn't it like a woman to compliment you to your face and then insult you behind your back? I thought that was great. She goes to Buckingham Palace and they're having this great heart-to-heart conversation. These two powerful women, and then she completely fucks her at a party. It's like, see, you can you dress these women up and put them in high place affairs, but they still act like the wives of New Jersey.
The wives of New Jersey. I don't know. I think the funny part of it was the thing I thought about is that, well, damn, they were able to get an American to give a pretty spot-on version of Churchill with John Lithgow. Maybe they should have hired an Englishman to play Kennedy.
Anything else about the Dear Miss Kennedy episode?
Like I said, I think the one thing about it is that it gives Elizabeth a couple of great moments in terms of her going to Ghana and playing the diplomat and playing the head of state and doing those sorts of things that are, a big part of that kind of unique role of the crown.
Yeah.
And I do think some of the interrelationship things there, but I found the performances rather distracting.
Paterfamilias. God, I watched that one. And look, I'm a proponent of, I have a son and I have a daughter, and I am a proponent for both of them, but especially my son to grow up and be able to take on life slings and arrows, with the degree of stalwartness. Be a man. Grow up and be a good person, but be tough. Know the world doesn't know you any favors, and don't and know that sometimes you got to push yourself that extra mile. I don't think that's a whole lot to ask. And I'm watching this episode. And this is the episode where, even though our queen wants to send Charles to Eton College, Philip says, nope, he's going to Gordonston, and that's where I went, and that'll make him into a man. And you see where he's coming from. The kid's a bit of a fop, and and he wants him to understand that, and he says it right in the episode, that life doesn't work this way. And as much as you don't want to see kids get bullied, and you don't want to see them get tortured or anything else like that, you do want them to grow up and understand that life doesn't owe you any favors, and there's not always going to be a guy there to fucking peel your egg for you.
Yeah.
So it was so much like the much like episode 6. You could definitely see both sides of the argument here.
Yeah, definitely. And again, and obviously this gets deep into some theorizing around Philip's psyche, and this is kind of the first big introduction we've had to Charles as a character, who is going to become a major player as the season goes on. And it is interesting that if you watch a lot of stuff about Charles, he is kind of put out there as kind of this more interesting character about. In terms of his personality and some of his views and things like that. You definitely kind of see both sides of where that goes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's times when you feel for Charles in a deep way. There's times when you feel for Philip in a deep way. There's times when you think he's an absolute asshole.
Sure.
And it's kind of this same thing. That was a tough episode to also go through when you go through some of the stuff in Philip's background.
Yeah. As a father, did it ring any of your bells? Did it touch you in any way? Did you find yourself reflecting on relationship with your children, or were you like nah, this don't touch me at all?
I think you always kind of have that degree of debate, that degree of conflict on trying to be conscious between, how do you how do you raise your kids to take on the world? How do you also not jade them to the world either?
Right. Do you go?
Oh, yeah, a good way of saying it.
Do you go Cobra Kai or do you go Miyagi Dojo? Which is the better path?
We're plugging early, are we, Mark?
Yep, I'm sowing seeds, sir.
Oh no, I'm looking forward to that one. That'll be good. So, but I mean, no, exactly. That's not a bad analogy. But I mean, I think you've seen. If you want to get into psychoanalysis on this, it's kind of interesting where, if you want to start looking at the real royal family, and they kind of put a couple of chirons on at the end to talk about how both William and Harry ended up going to Eton, and then but then on the flip side, they also went on to kind of take what I think you can call kind of working roles in the military for a period of years to try and balance things out.
Sure. I think it does speak to you. You don't necessarily have to, go out in the woods to live deliberately and, and build yourself a castle in in the swamp to learn how to be a man.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's I think this is going to be where we're going to get into things down the seasons. But I mean, I remember hearing stories about Charles where it's like he was still getting someone putting the toothpaste on his toothbrush into his 20s. Yeah, I mean, kind of the flip side to that is also I can't remember if they put in the Chiron or not, but basically the rest of the children of the royal family all ended up going to Gordonston actually.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, so all of like Princess Anne's kids, Andrew's kids. I don't think Edward's kids are old enough, and actually out of that, you actually got a Olympic silver medalist.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think there's a definitive, yes or no on this. I think, look, just to give you an analogy, so both my kids are school choice. I don't know if they have this sort of thing up in Canada, but
School choice.
School choice, which is basically, I don't want to send my kids to the district school. It sucks. I'm going to apply to the district to send them to the school of my choice because the school of my choice is better. Now, it just so happens that the school of my choice here is the one that my wife works at, which is also near where my mother-in-law lives. So it was a matter of convenience, but also the elementary school that my daughter goes to, on paper, at the very least, is a shade better than the one down the block from our house. So
yeah, we've got something similar, kind of. So in Canada, and this gets into a very long story, we actually have two school board systems in every province. What's called the public system, and then what's called the separate school board, which is actually the Catholic school board. So both my wife and I were raised Catholic, though we're pretty lapsed at this point, but we're able to send our kids to Catholic school, so we ended up sending our daughter to the local Catholic school, which tends to be a little bit better on average.
Okay. So when my daughter first goes to kindergarten at the elementary school, there was a decided choice to put her with a particular. There are a number of teachers per grade, and
right.
She went to kindergarten, and it was there was a definitive choice to put her with one particular teacher. She had a softer touch, and my daughter is fairly thin-skinned, and she even with me as a father, as bombastic as I can be, does better with sort of a motherly kind of coaching and touch, and she somebody who is going to lightly push her along. And then in this first and second grade, much of the same thing. There was decisions to make sure that we put Lily with somebody who was going to be good for her mentality. My son's coming along. He's going into kindergarten this August, and they say, put him with none of the teachers that you put my daughter with. My son will eat them alive. There is talk going around going, we need to put him with the teacher who's going to call him on his shit, who's going to challenge him, because my son may be one of those who test gifted, and the conundrum with the gifted kids is they're smart, obviously, but they're also the kids that that are hard to control because they're bored easily. So they need to be challenged on an ongoing basis. And you need a teacher who, isn't going to be manipulated by a child who's really, really good at that sort of thing. Go ahead.
No, I was agree. I got what you were getting at.
So, and so where this relates to, paterfamilias, it's like, do you... There is an argument to the soft touch. There are kids who are just not going to thrive in an environment where, like the one at Gordonston, they'll just crumble. And what the lessons they'll learn will not be the lessons you want them to learn. By the same token, you'll have kids who, you go to Gordonston, a school at Gordonston, and you'll rise to the challenge. It will make you tougher. It will make you more able to handle life slings and arrows, and it'll cut the fat off you and make you a man's man. So I don't, so there's no right answer to this. Though the portrayal in the episode is that this was an absolute torturous mess for this poor child.
Yeah, definitely for Charles, it was, and I think you kind of get shades of where it was with Philip, and it definitely taps into his perception of otherness as being this kind of exiled aristocrat that a lot of the other boys kind of take shots at and things like that. One interesting thing, sorry, I'm just on one of the Wikipedia pieces here right now, and the interesting thing is that he was actually with that schoolmaster because when he lived in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So Kurt Hahn, the man who ran Gordonston, so he was actually Jewish. So he had been running this school and for a number of years in Germany, and then the Nazis showed up, and he's like, "I'm getting the hell out of here." George, go ahead.
Nope, you're on.
And even when you look at it, his philosophy espoused in the show, I can't speak to what it was in real life, was that, kind of building brotherhood through this level of hard work and toil and struggle on some level. Which
I can see. But not every child will thrive in that kind of an environment.
Oh yeah. I was involved in the Royal Canadian Air Cadets here in Canada, which is kind of a youth group that is funded by the Department of National Defense and kind of promotes military values and things like that. I spent a couple of years out at a camp during the summer to run cadets for the kind of the basic summer camp course. There are definitely cadets who go out there and they really, and even the quiet ones who show up and they thrive, and there's other ones who just can't handle it.
I remember my daughter did something years ago. My daughter did something, or she wasn't supposed to, or whatever, and it wasn't even like she misbehaved, but it was like she didn't push herself the way that I thought she should have. And I remarked about it, kind of harshly, which in retrospect I should not have done. But I thought, because of the way I was raised and the way my father talked to me, that I was doing the right thing and saying the right thing. I was negatively trying to inspire her. That's how I grew up. Negative inspiration. And
the Red method?
Excuse me?
The Red Foreman method?
Yes, exactly. Come here, dumbass. Let me show you how this is done. And so I said something of the negative inspiration model, and I was expecting her to be like, "No, that isn't true," and I'm going to try harder, and be challenged by it, and be pushed by it the way that I was when said those things. And she actually said, "Okay, I guess you're right, Dad." You ever just want to throw yourself out a fucking window when you know you've made a mistake saying something to your child?
Oh, definitely. I had one of those moments today.
Okay.
I do want to bring up one other thing in relation to this episode, as it connects back to the last episode about David and the whole Nazi thing. Obviously they're a big part of what's going on because, like I said, Philip's family was Danish. His sister ended up marrying into this aristocratic German family that was obviously deep in with the Nazis. And, I mean, obviously you have this, I want to talk about the funeral scene because it's, watching that today is a bizarre thing when you start to realize, like how much of a complete influence that government had over its people. And then the flip side to the point you brought up about, kind of people rolling with the punches to some extent when the Nazis were coming up. Something they admitted from that scene was that, from what I understand reading this, I'd have to go back and double check my source, because, when in Rome, Philip actually gave the Sieg Heil, the Nazi salute during that funeral.
Mm. Now, was he doing it because, again, you used the phrase "when in Rome"? It was like, well, I'm here. This is the proper thing to do. It's not like I am believing in this philosophy, but this is what we do here, so I'm doing it. Or was he like, yeah, I hate the Jews too, Sieg Heil?
I think it was probably more of a when in Rome thing, because that was that. I mean, if you actually go back far enough, like in the early 30s, there's actually a very, pre-adolescent. I think there's one of like the Queen giving it at some point. Mm. Because again, it was kind of trying to maintain good relations and going with, it's like, if you go to Japan and you start bowing.
Can you imagine if they had Twitter back then?
Oh God.
You're doing what you think is right. You're doing what you think is culturally appropriate. You do the Sieg Heil thing. You have absolutely no opinion on Jews one way or the other. You certainly don't want them murdered in ovens. But you're there, and it's appropriate to a degree, and there you are, and you do the Sieg Heil, and somebody snaps a picture with their phone, and it's on Twitter. The Queen's a Nazi.
Well, I mean, it could be worse. Like I said, I'm really looking forward to that episode where they have to address the whole thing that Harry did in Vegas a few years ago. A quick aside on that one. At the time that happened, I was actually taking I can remember if it was a history of Germany course in university or one about totalitarianism. But I walk in the class like a couple days after that happens, and the topic of the day was kind of the legacy of the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And I kid you not, on the projector on the screen was Harry in his stupid Nazi getup with "Springtime for Hitler" playing in the background, and us all laughing our asses off. And the teacher came in, and the professor came in, and he made this, very good conversation. It's like, these guys did horrible things. Why is it okay to laugh at them? Anyway, that's just kind of a funny story. I'm not going down that rabbit hole either, because we could be here all night.
No, I'll start quoting all kinds of things from Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1, and we will be here for another hour. All right.
I will say very quickly, on that topic of Mel Brooks, the Nazis, all that sort of thing, she's been mentioned before on this channel by Sean, but YouTuber Lindsay Ellis does a really good video on kind of the nature of satire and Mel Brooks, and specifically some of his stuff around the Nazis on a really good YouTube vid. So I'll PM you that one after the episode's over.
All right. Last thing, and then we're going to call it a night here. I think we've covered this pretty well. But I want to go back to, I believe it's marionettes, and Lord Altrincham.
Yes.
And so what we have here is, we talked about this earlier, that this season, the duties and the attitude and the whole the concept of the crown fit better on the Queen this season than in the previous season. She's coming into her own, but occasionally she fucks up. And, in this particular case, she gives a speech where she's like, she essentially gave just short of a let 'em eat cake speech. That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And
your poor menial.
Right. Yeah. It is important that you continue to do terrible work. Something along those lines. And of course, the Lord Altrincham sees this and rightly so criticizes it. And so you have this war of words between the crown and him. And this is where I need you to kind of jump in here. What happened once they were able to meet, and he sort of able to be the Yoda to her Luke Skywalker, in terms of relating to the people.
I'm not going to lie, that's probably something I'm not as familiar with, but I mean, I think you start to see kind of the pattern of what we see about, the crown today, being this, and it's definitely a change in the way people, or the way the crown is perceived, and the way the crown perceives itself and its subjects, and going from, slightly less, I'm going to use the phrase ironically, kind of, patriarchal, father of the state, mother of the state sort of thing. Well, that's probably a good shift, is going from the father of the state, do your chores, to being kind of the more inspirational, this is Britain, this kind of collectivism. This is how we we should be proud of what we do, that sort of thing.
Okay. What'd you think of the episode? Any thoughts there?
Not a ton, as I remember. I mean, I kind of had it on silent here as we're talking about this, trying to remember. But I mean, you see a couple little shifts here. For example, like you start to see the Queen take on her more kind of well-known hairstyle. You have, the Duke obviously having quite a bit of criticism, and at least one solid right hook thrown his way. And to put that in perspective really quick, there are definitely some very hardcore royalists out there. I have friends who I consider myself a royalist, but I have friends who are so royalist they will not watch this show.
Can you expound on that for just a minute? Like what's the deal, man?
Basically, I think their kind of shorthand is that because they feel it hasn't really been endorsed by the crown and by Buckingham Palace, that it's a little bit of it's a little bit kind of outside what is kosher, basically.
Okay.
Are you also asking me about my royalism?
No, sir. All right. I think we can. Anything else? I'm going to let you have the last word here. Anything left unsaid?
I'm going to say, because I think the other thing about this series is that this is the end of this current cast. So this cast, the whole plan is that they're going to do 6 seasons, and they're going to swap cast every 2 seasons. So right now, this is kind of the end of Claire Foy and Matt Smith and Vanessa Kirby as being in these roles. And we've kind of talked about the character, but I got to talk about Claire Foy, because when you kind of grow up with seeing stuff about the Queen on TV, you kind of get used to hearing and sounding and catching mannerisms, and her performance can be downright unsettling at times, how much it is like her. Like, she just hits inflections in her voice, and it's like, is that actually the Queen? Or it's a pretty remarkable performance. So, and the interesting thing is they have actually started to announce the cast for the next season. Which, it's...
Any thoughts there? And you like the cast? You're like confused by it? Like, what's the deal there?
Yes and no. So right now, the cast they've announced so far is Olivia Colman, who just won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She's actually going to be taking over as Queen Elizabeth. An actor named Tobias Menzies, who probably is best known as either Brutus in the HBO Rome series, or he played Blackjack in Outlander, is going to be playing Prince Philip. And then here's the interesting one. Helena Bonham Carter is going to be playing Princess Margaret.
Love it. Love it. As long as she doesn't bring Tim Burton with her.
Yeah, exactly. And that one's kind of the interesting one, because in terms of getting into age and casting, is that obviously she's playing the younger sister, but she's quite a bit older than the other 2 characters. It's also quite funny to me because Olivia Colman was also one of the bit players in Hot Fuzz, if you're ever familiar with that movie.
I am familiar with the movie. I don't remember the actor, though.
She's the other constable in the back of the station who's always getting the double entendres made about her.
Okay. I vaguely remember that now.
Yeah. Just rewatch Hot Fuzz because it's one of the best goddamn movies of all time.
Fair enough. All right, I think that's a wrap. We still don't know when season 3 is coming out. If it's anything like the last 2 seasons, it'll be around either December of this year. I think I guess they're filming now, so maybe we'll see it December of this year. Maybe sometime in 2020. It's as intricate as these sets are and everything else. It takes a long time to get these done, so we'll see. In the meantime, since I have Andrew Graham here, it was announced today that Cobra Kai is returning to YouTube, their paid platform. It'll be, I believe, April 24th. And as I look through the calendar here, I have it programmed for June 20th, Thursday, June 20th. And that's just because we've got so much on the calendar. We've got the Game of Thrones, the Umbrella Academy, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, She-Ra. There's a lot going on that was already on the calendar already, so that was literally the first available slot I had.
All right, on that one, my work might be a little crazy at that time, but I definitely want to do season 2 for that one.
Okay. If June 20th doesn't work out for you, let me know and we'll move it around again. I wanted to get it as close to the actual debut date as possible, but we can always move things around. God knows we move this show around enough. So
yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. But at least in pencil, on paper, Andrew Graham will be with us again for actually you'll be with us 2 times that week. We'll have you on Monday, though we'll have recorded it the week before, for Gotham Central, and then we'll have you on that Thursday for Cobra Kai Season 2.
Okay, I need to go read up. Are we just doing Volume 1 of Gotham Central?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'll reread that and maybe skip ahead as well.
Sweet. In the meantime, in between time, here's what we got going on in the month of March here on the Radulich Broadcasting Network. This week we looked at the Avengers, the Kree-Skrull War from the 1970s, and woof, what a ride that was on source material. There was no show Tuesday night. We were no, I take that back. King Kong Bundy had just passed away, so Pat and I did a retrospective of King Kong Bundy's career. We reviewed the new Queensryche, The Verdict, and The Metal Hammer of Doom. Next week, we've got Captain Marvel, Higher, Faster, Further, Volume 1 on source material. I'll have, from our Canadian office, once again, David Wright and then Alexis Haina to review Captain Marvel on Damn You Hollywood. We'll be reviewing the new In Flames, I the Mask. And then right before my spring break cruise, Robert Winfrey is going to subject me to One Punch Man on TV Party Tonight. While I'm away, the Cats will play. Jesse Starcher will be bringing you Fatal Attractions on source material. What else happens that week? I don't know. I won't be here. So, when we come back, we will have a couple of Scooby-Doo shows for you. Scooby-Doo Apocalypse on source material. Damn You Hollywood, The Doit. Jesse Starcher will be on to check out that Netflix movie with us. We'll be looking. Pat Mullen, Mr. Toxic Masculinity himself, will be on The Metal Hammer of Doom to look at Motley Crue's greatest hits. And finally, there'll be an on-trial for Scooby-Doo 2, Monsters Unleashed. That Saturday, there's boxing. Alexander, something Polish, versus Dowdow, something African. Pat and I will bring you live commentary. It'll be fantastic. And with that said, I'm going to give you the final word here to Mr. Graham. Plug away, sir. What you got going on?
Let's see now. We'll just talk about where I'm training at right now, which is, of course, Esteemed Martial Arts and Havoc JKD in Calgary, Alberta. Also, the future filming, Calgary in general, is going to be the future filming location of the next Ghostbusters movie, so how about that? I do want to give a special shout out tonight. One of our instructors at Havoc JKD, and esteemed Sarah Jade Folk, just took 6 provincial medals for, I believe it was mostly sparring at one of the provincial martial arts championships. So a great big congratulations to you, SJ, on all those accomplishments and all your hard work you put in there. So Havoc on that one. Anyway, I mean, obviously you can find Esteemed Martial Arts and Havoc JKD on Facebook, and definitely through me as well. I'm also going to give a quick shout out and plug to a good friend of ours, Victoria Smith, who's got what was on the voting list for Calgary's best podcast for Girl Tries Life. So go check that out as well. And I guess the only other plug for me for this year is, hey, I get to be on trial against Sean later this year for 13 hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi.
I'm looking forward to that.
So am I. My only thing is I got to watch that goddamn movie one more time. I might reread the book, which is good, but yeah, we'll get into that.
Yes, that's later to come this year. All right, I want to thank Andrew Graham from our Canadian office for being on the show. I'm glad we finally got a chance to do this. I'd have been absolutely mortified if we had never gotten a chance to talk about Season 2. So I'm glad we finally got that done, and we're moving on to bigger and better things. With that said, thank you for joining us here on TV Party Tonight. We hope to offend you at some point in the future.
Time to rethink your skin health routine and experience HydraFacial, the completely customizable technology that professionally cleanses, extracts, and hydrates your skin, leaving you refreshed and glowing in just 30 minutes. Visit hydrafacial.com to find a provider near you.
Can your fixed income stand the test of time? Markets change, but the role of fixed income shouldn't. That's why for more than 40 years, MFS has stayed true to our traditional approach. We call it Essential Fixed Income. Find out more at mfs.com/fixed income.